Meanwhile, back in the known world, something was happening in Kosovo. Convoys were rolling along country roads and mortars were throwing up puffs of smoke on distant hills. Bill Clinton was in some kind of moral hot water again, or so I assumed because he was shown strolling through the rose garden holding hands with Hillary and Chelsea, all of them looking mutually devoted. They had a lovable spaniel with them as well, which I took as a sign that the president had been very bad indeed. It hardly mattered. It all seemed so far away. Then lots of sports, all of it featuring Australians performing commendably. Finally, a weather chart came on and showed sun everywhere, and then the newscaster tapped her papers square and smiled in a way that suggested that we could all go to bed happy because Greg Norman was winning the golf and everything else was a long, long way away and didn't really affect us. It is amazingly easy in Australia to forget, or at least to reduce to a dim awareness that there is a world out there. Australians work hard in their news coverage to overcome the handicap of distance, but even so, sometimes around the margins of the news, you get a curious sense of disconnectedness. Little things that remind you that this is far, far country. I had noticed, for instance, that Australian newspapers commonly run obituaries, particularly of foreign figures, weeks and even sometimes months after they die. That's fair enough in a sense, I suppose. These people are going to be dead forever after all. But it does lend the pages a curiously leisured air. Then the previous day on my flight from Melbourne to Sydney, while browsing through a copy of the Bulletin, the country's venerable news magazine, I read the section called Flashback, which recorded important events in history on that week's date. For January 22nd, it had this interesting entry. 1934, actor Bill Bixby died 1993, is born in Park Ridge, Illinois, US. Consider that just for a moment in a column devoted to significant moments in world history, the birth date of an actor whose culminating achievement was to play the straight man in a 1960s television series called My Favorite Martian is still being recalled in Australia 6 years after his death. Well, I think that's kind of spooky, frankly. I appreciate, of course, that this was a filler item at the back of the magazine and one shouldn't read too much into it, so let me offer a rather more compelling piece of temporal eccentricity. As I sat at the bar, now I pulled out my own one-volume history of Australia by Manning Clark and dutifully ploughed into it. I had only about 30 pages left, and I would be less than candid if I didn't tell you that I couldn't wait to have Mr. Clark and his extravagant drawings out of my life forever. Still, Australia's history is an interesting one, and I had a comfy stool and the prospect of as much beer as I wanted, so I wasn't unhappy. So I sat and read the rest of the book, and here's the thing, it finished in 1935. After 619 pages of the densest exposition, the book terminates with the appointment of John Curtin as leader of the Australian Labor Party on October 1st, 1935. This is, let me stress, the standard current one-volume history of Australia, the one to which you will be directed in every bookshop in the land, and it finishes in 1935. That's 16 prime ministers ago. I was so dumbfounded that I actually lifted the book over my head to see if some pages had fallen out, then looked on the floor around my bar stool. But no, the book finished by design in 1935. Manning Clark died or yielded the final tortured spark of life, as I am sure he would have wished me to put it, in 1991, so I was prepared to excuse him the last decade or so of Australia's eventful saga, but I would not have thought he would find space for, let us say, World War II, although his history was written long after the war. Specifically between 1962 and 1987, as a series of 6 books, of which I held the distilled essence. It contains not one mention of the most important event of the 20th century. There is not even a hint of gathering storm clouds, nor does the text find room for the Cold War, Aboriginal land reforms, the emergence of a multicultural society, the fall of the Whitlam government, the move to become a republic, or the life and times of Bill Bixby, among rather a lot else. To cover this troubling gap, the publishers had introduced into the present edition and afterward a coda written by the book's editor and abridger. This condensed the last 65 years of Australian history into 34 pages, which, as you can imagine, gave the whole a somewhat breathless and incidental flavor. And until the 1995 edition, it didn't even have that. Well, I find that extremely odd. That's all I'm saying. Sighing, I closed my book and realized I was famished. According to a sign on the door across the room, the Nambucca had a restaurant, so I wandered over to investigate, but the door wouldn't open. "Dining room's closed, mate," said one of the 2 guys at the bar. "Chef's crook." Crook means ill. "Must have ate some of his own cooking," came a voice from the Pokies' alcove, and we all had a grin over that. "What else is there in town?" I asked. "Depends," said the man, scratching his throat thoughtfully. He leaned toward me slightly. "You like good food?" I nodded. Of course I did. "Nothing then." He went back to his beer. "Try the Chinese over the road," said his companion. "It's not too bad." The Chinese restaurant was just across the road as promised, but according to a sign in the window, it was not licensed to serve alcohol, and I couldn't face small-town Chinese food without the solace of beer. I have traveled enough to know that a chef does not, as a rule, settle in a place like Maxville because he has a lifelong yearning to share the subtleties of 3,500 years of Sichuan cuisine with sheep farmers. So I went off to see what else there might be in Maxville's compact heart. The answer was very little. Everything appeared to be shut except one small takeout establishment called, not altogether promisingly, Bub's Hot Bakes. I opened the door, briefly enlivening 5,000 flies that had dropped by to see what Bub and his team were up to, and stepped inside knowing in my heart that this was almost certainly going to be a regretted experience. Bub's had a large range of food, nearly all of it involving brown meat and gravy lurking inside pastry. I ordered a large sausage roll and chips. "We don't do chips," said the amply proportioned serving maiden. "Then how did you get like that?" I wanted to say, but of course I suppressed this unworthy thought and revised my order to a large sausage roll and something called a continental cheesecake square and went with them outside. I ate standing on a corner. I take nothing away from Bob's culinary prowess, I trust, when I tell you that the large sausage roll and the continental cheesecake square were not the most satisfying possible culmination to a night on the town, even in as remote and challenging a spot as Maxville. Besides, it was only 7:30 in the evening. I weighed my options: TV back in the motel, a sunset stroll along the highway, or more beer in the Nambuka, and toddled back into the Nambuka. The two men at the bar had departed, and their place had been taken by a lone woman who was engaged in some deep and earnest conversation with the barmaid, clearly involving gossip, judging from their pinched and animated faces. Ah, he's all right in his place. They just haven't dug it yet. I heard one quip dryly to the other. I acquired another beer and retired with it to my favored spot at the bar, where I cracked open my book of maps to see where exactly I stood. It had only begun to dawn on me in the last day or two just how much of this amazingly vast and ungainly country I had still to tackle. I had been driving around almost continuously now for 4 weeks, and I had covered only the tiniest portion of it. What's more, I had done the easy parts, the parts that are well paved and reasonably inhabited. Altogether, Australia has 180,000 miles of paved highway, enough to keep a dedicated driver occupied for about the year, but the great bulk of it is bundled into the populous Eastern Corridor. Elsewhere, over vast areas, there is nothing. Not an inch of paved road exists along the nearly 2,000 miles of indented coastline from Darwin to Cairns, which must make it one of the longest, not to say comeliest, stretches of coastline in the world not touched by highway. Similarly, no road intrudes on the tropical lushness that stretches for 500 miles from just beyond Cairns to the tip of Cape York, Australia's northernmost point, and another area of superlative beauty. In the whole of Queensland, an area into which you could comfortably fit most of Western Europe, just 3 paved roads venture into the state's vast and arid interior, and only one provides an outlet to the 2/3 of Australia that lies to the west. From Camooweal in the north to Barringham in the south, you could, if you were completely out of your mind, walk 1400 miles of Queensland border. That's about the distance from New York to New Orleans without once crossing a highway. Travel any distance into the interior and you are, with amazing swiftness, in an empty country. The outback does have dirt tracks in relative abundance, 300,000 miles of them altogether, but standard rental cars aren't allowed on them, and even in a fully equipped off-road vehicle, it is a brave or foolhardy driver who ventures out on his own because it is so easy to get lost or stranded. Just recently, a young couple from Austria on a trip into the outback in a rented 4x4 had sunk into their axles in sand on a lonely, nameless track in a Simpson desert. When they realized they were hopelessly embedded, the woman decided to hike 40 miles to the Odnadatta track, where rescue was more likely. Why the woman went and not the man, I don't know. What is known is that she took 9 of the 12 liters of water and set off into 140 Fahrenheit heat. For most of us, it is not possible to conceive just how punishing such heat is. Under a full sun with temperatures that high, it is actually possible to begin to cook rather as you would in a microwave oven from the inside out. The poor woman didn't stand a chance. Even with a good supply of water, she lasted less than 2 days and covered just 18 miles, less than half the distance required. Her partner, sitting in shade, survived and was rescued. In short, you don't want to be caught in the outback. My more immediate problem was what I was going to do with my last couple of days. My original program called for me to go to Brisbane, Surfers Paradise and the Big Banana at Coffs Harbour. But I didn't really have time now to see Brisbane, at least not in any meaningful way, and I wasn't all that excited about the Big Banana. I mean no disrespect to a national treasure, but my devotion to giant fruit goes only so far. So as I sat at the bar now, I idly leafed through the pages, looking at the alternative diversions. Byron Bay, Dorrigo National Park, the Darling Downs of South Queensland, when 2 words, printed small and attached to a pale and erratic blue line, leapt out at me. I had my destination. I was going to a place called Myrtle Creek. It was time to consider Australia's forgotten people.